Hello everybody, welcome to Alan Wall's Photography's Back to Basics macro video series. This is a series that's going to probably take about 4 or 5 months to finish. It may be as many as 20 videos, we'll have to see. And in these videos, I'm going to introduce you to some concepts that are a little on the more on the basic end of things than some of the stuff we talk about generally. So this is for people who are looking for a refresher or getting started or just making the transition to serious macro and want to make sure that you have all the basics down, the fundamentals. This is not a course in macro photography. And that is a subtle but important distinction. When I talk about a course, I'm talking about a very comprehensive and complete, exhaustive look at macro photography from the beginner's point of view. And I am going to be releasing that course sometime in the next few months. Now, that is going to be distinctly different from this. That's something that you will want to have a copy of so that you can refer back to. It'll be a lot more information than you're going to get in these short videos. These are going to be snapshots from the course. These videos are being released on YouTube, but there is a similar video, only a little bit longer with a little bit more content, that's being released to my Patreon supporters. In addition to that, every video will come with a series of exercises for those people who are following along on Patreon. In addition to that, there will be a live stream Q&A event for every video. So in addition to the enhanced videos, the exercises, and the live streams over on Patreon, the Patreon folks are also going to be able to get the course itself when it comes out at a discount that will pay for their entire year of Patreon at the $10 level. So if you are thinking about at any point in the future investing in a macro photography course, now would probably be a really good time, because even though the course isn't available just yet, Patreon is. And the day before this video came out, the enhanced version of this video came out to the Patreon folks. That's another thing. They get ad-free videos and early videos. What are we going to do in these 20 videos? We're going to hit the high points. And the first high point is a little bit of a discussion about what macro photography is and how we're going to define it. In the second video, I'm going to talk about cameras, what you need, what you can get by with, and give you some actual suggestions for cameras that I think would do the trick. In the third video, we'll get into lenses, and we'll talk specifically about macro lenses and things that you can use as macro lenses. And from there, it'll go on and continue to evolve. It'll all make sense, and it will be fairly linear. But today, we're talking about macro photography and what it is. The consensus is that a macro photograph is a photograph of something small that allows you to see detail that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. You'd need a magnifying glass to see what a macro photograph will show you. And that probably sums it up about as well as anything. For the sake of this discussion and future discussions on my channel, close-up photography and macro photography are the same. I don't have a distinction about what extreme macro photography is. Again, you know it. I mean, if you're having to buy a microscope objective to take a picture, that's pretty extreme. So what I don't want to do is get hung up on points of language. I like to think of macro photography as being a compromise, a group of compromises. It's not just a matter of scale. There are a lot of trade-offs in macro photography because we tend to be operating at the limits of our equipment. And when you get to the limits of what our lenses and cameras and lights can do, you start introducing problems. And this whole concept of macro photography is about learning how to balance the risks and make the best decisions you can. So let's talk specifically about what these problems are and how they relate to macro photography. So what do we mean when we talk about depth of field? That simply means that for a given aperture and lens, there will be a certain amount of the image that is acceptably sharp for our perception to say, yeah, that's sharp, or that's a single point if it was a dot that you were photographing. As you go forward through the picture or backwards back out of the picture through layers of the picture, that point becomes more of a blob where it's no longer in sharp focus. And when we talk about depth of field, we're talking about how long is that point to point before it becomes a blob. And if our depth of field is deep enough, then we can photograph something and have the whole thing in focus. And that doesn't happen in macro photography. It doesn't happen at this kind of scale. As we get higher and higher magnification, our depth of field gets shallower and shallower until we're talking about fractions of a millimeter, microns, so that only a sliver, invisibly small sliver of a picture is in focus. And because of the fact that the aperture largely affects the depth of focus, we can manipulate the aperture of our camera to get more depth of focus, so we can get closer to having what we want in focus. But you can only take that so far. Once your aperture gets small enough, it starts to produce so much, it produces interference to the passage of light, no matter how big it is, at f2.8, at f.95, or whatever that Noct lens is. That also has diffraction. You just don't notice it because there's so much light going through the rest of the aperture. But at f22, where you've got a pinhole, a huge amount of that light is being interfered with by passage through the opening of the aperture. And that interference sets up these patterns of interaction where the light rays are adding and subtracting from one another and creating these areas of softness. You've probably heard of the airy disk and the circle of confusion. Well, that's just a way of quantifying how big this depth of field limit is. So clearly, there is an aperture at which you can't really go any further. At 1:1, that's about f20, I think most people would agree. Above f20, the diffraction gets really off-putting, the softening from it. Below f20, and the further below you go, the less obvious it becomes, is in the safe zone. But what about at the other end of the spectrum, if we open the iris up all the way? So if f22 is bad, then surely f1.2 is the best for macro. It's not actually. Of course, it's a trade-off like everything else. And the bigger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and the more difficult it is to get an acceptable picture unless you're using a workaround like focus stacking. The other thing is, as your aperture gets bigger and bigger, you get to the point where you introduce aberrations, chromatic aberrations, geometric aberrations, field changes, to where the image is spoiled that way. So that's a trade-off. Other trade-offs are also found in other kinds of photography too, but the exposure triangle is a good example of that. In macro photography, you are oftentimes working with reduced light. And we'll get into that when we get into lenses and talk about why that would be. But we're working with less light than we'd like. So what do you do when you have less light? You either add light or you make some changes to your shutter speed or your ISO. So if you have done any photography at all, you should be familiar with the exposure triangle, it's called. It's the interplay between the shutter speed, the size of the aperture, and the ISO. The ISO being the amount of amplification of signal. So if your ISO is low, 100, 80, whatever your camera does, it's not amplifying the signal. It's reproducing the signal accurately. As your ISO gets up to 1,000, it's amplifying the little bit of light that's hitting your sensor and making it look brighter. What's the problem with that? Well, it also amplifies things that aren't there. That's called noise, and it shows up in your picture and it's fairly ugly. So there's a trade-off. Is there something else that we can do then? If we don't have enough light and we don't want to use more amplification, what do? Well, we can, again, add more light, or we could make the hole in the camera a little bit bigger. We could open up the aperture. Open up the aperture, more light will get through. We can turn our ISO back down again. So what's the problem with that? Well, our depth of field disappears, and we don't have nearly enough depth of field to take the picture. So we better close the aperture back down again. Let's do that. Now it's dark again. Oh, I'll tell you what, let's slow the shutter speed down. If we slow the shutter speed down so that it opens and sits open for a while to let lots of light through and then shuts, that'll fix it. We can do that, not increase the ISO and not open up the aperture. So we can get the depth of field and no noise. So that's what we'll do. And what do we get? What is the trade-off? Of course, the trade-off is when your shutter speed gets too slow, you get motion and movement in the shot. You can't hold a camera still that long. I can't anyway. So we have all these problems. There's a second layer of fixes that our technology takes care of, like image stabilization, especially the mirrorless cameras embody image stabilization. Some of it's really amazing, and it will give you some stops of light that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get, but that too will reach a limit eventually. And they're not the only trade-offs. There are others. There's a trade-off between magnification and working distance. The more magnified your image, to take a picture of a 2mm fruit fly that appears that big, which is almost filling a crop frame sensor, which was shot at 20 times magnification, you have to have your lens very close to your subject, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for lighting it. So there's a trade-off there. There's a trade-off with sensor size. A lot of us love our full-frame cameras, and I'll be talking about cameras next time, but we love a full-frame camera because of the quality of the image. But with a full-frame camera, relatively speaking, the same photograph will have much shallower depth of field. You got to think about that when you're picking up a camera to go shoot. The trade-off on the other end of that is if you want a camera that's going to give you plenty of depth of field, you grab your micro 4/3 camera, which I don't have out here, and that's great, but your field of view is now a fraction of what it was before, so you can't get the whole bug in there. So now you know what macro photography is and what makes it especially tricky sometimes. And in future episodes, I'll explain to you what we do about that. So next time we're going to be talking about cameras. Until then, stay well, be safe. See you next time.